So today we're going to talk about laying out some braces for our pavilion, Spence's Farm. This is a post and beam structure, and we have 23 braces to create. They are each designed to fit into some mortisons that are being put onto the posts. So we have some plans here that give us the specific, I don't know if this can be said, but these are the specific measurements. And I've laid out already, I don't know, over a dozen already, so it's pretty easy for me to do. But basically I'm using a single measurement here along and remeasuring all of these joints because every beam is just a little bit different. Gives it some accurate, well, very good accuracy actually. So I'm gonna show you how to lay out a specific joint as well as the whole beam. And I'll show you some cuts here all the way down to a complete product. And then I can show you what a piece looks like when it's completed. I don't have to do both ends to show you this. So to begin, you want to have a good ruler, and I like to use a metal ruler just because you want some precision. So a ruler like this is better than a tape measure for doing layout. So the tools that are required to do this process are that. So that's a layout setup. Now I've also made sure that I've got a really good point. You want a good point. And this is soft lead. So on this, the lead actually is important to have some soft lead. You want to make it so you leave a good line, but you don't gouge the wood. So if you get a too hard of a pencil, this is a number 2H, so it's very soft. And that means you're gonna use them up really fast. So that does matter. So step one in the process is you wanna look at the beam. So these beams were cut from trees and they're still green. So all of these beams are freshly cut and milled about 3 weeks ago. So they're still pretty gummy. You're gonna get a lot of fine sawdust. And you're gonna get a lot of sap. So the blades on your saw are gonna dull pretty quickly when it's this wet. But that's just a function. I mean, basically, you're gonna need blades for this. So we look down the beam. We're trying to find a bit of an arch. Just like if you were building sticks construction, you're looking for any kind of arc in the beam so you can orient to the rising part of the beam. Now a brace is going to be a 45-degree angle, right? So we want the arc actually kind of reversed like that. We want a 45. I'm using my arm as a brace. There would be a beam across the top. So by doing that, if you've got a really serious bend, you want to put that to the top. These beams so far have been very straight. So I still do look on each one though, because it's something you might want to consider when you're doing your layout. The next thing to consider is knots. And this beam just happens to have only a few knots. This knot down here. But you want to look at how that's going through the beam. Several other knots, so you want to look the beam over and find the knots so that you can do your layout so that your joints don't actually end up having now I'm pointing this out because in this particular beam there was no choice. We had to go with whatever this is the best we could do with that beam. Now we've got extra stock and I'll probably make a new one, but in this case it's not as bad as if it was in the middle of it. So I'm using examples. There are knots in some of these, but it's only because I couldn't avoid it based on the number of beams. One way to do more production oriented, you want to make sure that each of these is the same size. You basically want to measure your results. What I mean is, I'm looking at the overall accuracy of the beam I'm using to test with, and I recommend doing that too. since every brace is getting measured by itself, you should end up with accuracy all the way through. We're not using it as a template. In other words, we're not just scribing lines. We're actually remeasuring every beam to make sure every brace is exact. You want accuracy. So, what are we doing this for? It's easier to use something that's already been cut out to kind of examine where you might have a knot and where it's going to fall onto the brace. And I'll use an example here. Like this knot here, I would want to make sure I avoid it. Or if I can't avoid it, I would want to make sure it's somewhere inside the brace itself, not on the joint. Does that make sense? So, what I'm using the beam for, the brace and the next to the beam, is to decide to get two of these braces out of this one piece. How would I need to adjust down the length of the beam? So, fortunately, there's that down here. We can make it happen in the middle. We got plenty of beam left, so let's now go forward. So you can see I've already begun making choices and decisions about where this brace will come. And I will show you what I did. The first step was, okay, so where do I avoid this knot? How do I avoid this knot? So I moved it just beyond here from this point. Now I can take a speed square and just draw a line that matches that, right? So I'm only doing that so that I know that I'm accurately positioning the brace. And that's all I need to do. Put it back. So again, for the specifics of this brace, I'm following this. It may change depending on the structure. So I'm using these measurements based on the measurements I'm instructed to use. The process will be the same no matter what the size. The measurements might be different. So I know that I'm going to start with this end and work off this beam section, but I want to lay out overall thing. So using something that can accurately measure across the top, I go ahead and find my second place for the opposite angles, and then go ahead and scribe there. Now I know where my beam is, and I can start to lay it out. The second part of that is using speed square as it's used to go ahead and start with the 45s that are making up the tenon part of this beam. So there are a couple of measurements that I've memorized because I've done a few already today and yesterday. So here's where this comes in. Using the precise matchup of these lines in a sharp point, I'm looking for the second 45-degree angle. And we know that it is 5.5 inches here, dead center of that line. So we're going to lay that out. All right, so this is the cross-section of the tenon. This little common tenon is going to stick out. And they're both they project at a 45-degree angle. So we do a scribe to both sides. I'm being efficient by holding the beam up high on its width. So I can do two sides at one time. My goal is that the lines scribed underneath this, which I'll get to in a minute, match all the way around so that the lines, when they come onto the edges, are matching. That way I know that when I make my cut with a circular saw, and that is if this is truly flat, then I should be able to see the curve of that saw follow this line. Then I know I'm at a 45 or a 90-degree angle. That's also good to know when we're trying to get very accurate joints. So there's one more angle that we need on each side. And this one is, it's a tiny little protrusion. You see it better on the beam, but I'm going to draw it out first. You see it better on the brace that's already created, because conceptually it took a couple of minutes to understand it. But basically, this joint is going to be hidden behind a little piece of this beam, so you don't see the scarf, the kerf of the cuts. It hides it. So what does that mean? Well, you see in a minute. So this is a tiny little piece of wood that's going to be protruding right here. And again, conceptually, it may not be obvious, but it will be in a minute. So same process here. We want to scribe it all the way around the beam. And Speed Scriber is very handy. It's designed well so that you can find where a line goes directly on the 90 degree by following these edges. So lining is up on both sides. Now we're going to flip the beam over and do the same line, and also check how accurate we're getting our lines. So this is an old line. I want to make sure that doesn't get in our way. No, that's the line we need. All right, so this line is going to draw back. Now, you may not see this yet, but basically it just validated that this line comes up and over and actually meets the line that I drew on the other side. So that's an accurate scribe. Last thing is to go ahead and finish finish all these curves. These cuts also have sides of the line that you want to cut on, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So this line here, just make sure it tells you when you make the cut. We're going to be cutting halfway through the beam because we got 2 inches depth set on our saw blade, and when we flip it over, we're going to end up cutting off pieces of chunks of the wood. So we want that kerf to match, and one way to know that it would is that we followed this line here, that we've gotten a 90 degree cut, and they meet, and the piece should fall off and leave you with very little of the kerf matching the other. Now, one thing to also note, and I'll get this in a minute, this little extra piece of buffer can buff that off. So I'm not so worried about it. It's great when it actually shows up that I matched the two curves, but we're talking about a 16th on one side and less than that on the other. And when you look at those joints, it actually doesn't even show up that there was a slight variation on the curve. So we've done with our measurements. We've gone all the way around the beam with our scribes, all the way around. So now this thing is completely laid out. One thing to keep myself straight is I'll say, okay, do not cut that line with the saw. Just don't go across this line. Another thing that I've set up in my mind so that I stay concentrated is that whenever I'm crossing another line, that I consider while I'm cutting, do I cross that line with the cut? Now the reason is you still have time when you're just beginning cuts to make an adjustment. But once you cross that line, you've crossed that line. and that cut may be permanent and you'd have to start laying out further down the beam. So that's just a way to check yourself, or this is how I do it. All right, so what this means is we are gonna cut to this line, and we're gonna cut to this line, and we're gonna cut to this line with our saw, right? But we are not gonna cut that. That's the reason. So the next step is put on your safety gear. Use safety goggles. I don't have any here, but today's payday and I'm buying some. So again, we're set to a depth. This blade's been very used. We've got a brand new blades coming, but I'm just showing you that it's set to a 2-inch depth so that we can get a kerf in here. So I said to cut this line and this line and this line. There's actually an order of operation. The first thing to know is we want to cut the kerf on the inside of this line. We want the meat of this beam all the way up to that line and cut to it. We're going to cut on the inside of this kerf. On this side, we carry on to the outside of this line. The reason is we want this to be 3 inches and 7/8. Cut to that line on the inside, or the outside, I guess it's the outside of that line. So that leaves the meat of this beam will be exact as we measured it, okay? We're gonna do the same with, because this right here is actually the tenon that we wanna cut out. So this defines the tenon. How we get the recessed part of the tenon is very easy. You just cut a bunch of curves. It removes 50% of the wood. By doing it this way, you remove 50% of the wood. So we're gonna make a bunch of cuts through it. You don't want to go outside the lines that we just did. That's why I defined them with cuts. And then after that, we'll flip the beam over, cut off the excess, and you'll see what I mean. I just wanted to note something. I found out after doing a few of these, it was easier to put a couple of scribes that are parallel to the lines so that I am able to work in little chunks because you can see you get pretty wild with it, and by the end of it I was ending up with too many tapers. This makes them so that I'm grouping them in fashions that are easy to control. next thing to do is to cut the tail end off the tenon. But remember I said you don't want to cut past this little point. So we cut up to that line. So we didn't go past that point. That'll become obvious in a minute. So this is where the conceptual understanding of where the tenon is becomes important, because we could actually mess up and have to start over at this point with all this investment. So one idea is that I save this last curve. This is just how I've figured out how not to mess up. Because we want to save this little piece right here, remember? And we're going to basically cut just up to that point. So one idea is, again, we're going to cut to the outside of this line, which should just make this whole piece fall off. So then we got less wood to cut.
When you say outside the line, you're going to leave the pencil mark?
Yes. So remember I talked about that curve? This is about an 1/16 of an inch curve. This could be due to some kind of unlevelness or unsquareness. But basically these pieces right here will tab off. So you're left with the perfect tenon. Does that make sense? So in other words, we did all these cuts on the bottom side. Those don't matter. It's going to be flush with this. That is the accurate cut we need. So then the last, same thing, we cut to the outside of that line, because this is the actual tenon. Stopping at that point, same thing, cut to the outside of this line. So we're done with the circular saw. We take your saw of your choice. I like to use Japanese pull saw, and we finish these cuts. So that, again, I was saying conceptually it's hard to see it in 2 dimension, but in 3 dimension you're ending up with this. Now we will be touching this with a grinder as a final finish, and there's a scribe line back here that we can use to just touch this with a grinder and get it very flat. So the final step for this side of the brace, it's very simple. So I said 50% of the material is cut out. Really, that's only if you cut precisely to the kerf. So 1/8 inch pieces. But it's significantly less material to work with. you're not cutting out a whole chunk. So this is a pretty sharp saw. Just clean it up. You don't want to gouge. And when you get close to the finish, just take some time.
That's it. Take a bow.
Take a bow.
Take a bow.